spent 40 years in the timber, but I've never seen a veteran ER doctor lose his mind until he reached into a mangled bear and felt a second heart beating inside its mid-back. What we found on Highway 20 was a biological machine that shouldn't exist, and the indigo blood on my hands is about to prove everything you know about Sasquatch is a lie. I've lived in these mountains long enough to know that a phone call after midnight never brings good news. When the bell rang on my bedside table that Tuesday, the air in my cabin felt thin, heavy with the scent of pine and old wood. It was a man I've known for a decade, a veteran medical professional who's seen every kind of injury the high country can throw at a person. He didn't say hello. He just asked if I still had that old topographical map of the Highway 20 corridor. His voice was brittle, like dry kindling ready to snap. He told me the sheriff's department was out there in the rain, blocking off a 2-mile stretch of road, claiming a logging truck had leveled a grizzly, but he'd been called in because the deputy on the scene thought the victim was a person. When he arrived, the scene was a chaotic blur of strobe lights and rain, but what he found under the heavy fur of that neighbor that Sasquatch made him question every year of medical school he'd ever completed. Why would a man of science call a mountain hermit like me in a state of total panic? It's because he realized the official reality was being rewritten in real time, right there on the wet asphalt. He told me the anatomy didn't make sense. As he knelt in the grit, his fingers sank into a dense, vibrating mass of muscle that felt like it was tuned to a frequency he could feel in his own chest. The being had ceased to exist in a way that defied the laws of biology. He described the creature as having a frame that dwarfed any bear I'd ever tracked. The legs were too long, the musculature too defined, and the scent, that's what got to him. It didn't smell like a wild animal. It smelled like burnt copper and ozone, the way the air feels just before a lightning strike. By the time he'd finished his initial assessment, a group of men in dark, unmarked rain gear had arrived. They pushed him back and began draping a heavy, reinforced tarp over the scene. But the doctor had seen enough. He'd felt that secondary rhythmic thrumming deep in the Sasquatch's back, a pulse where there should have been nothing but bone. I didn't sleep after that call. I sat by the window, watching the ridgeline of Highway 20, where the distant glow of emergency lights flickered. I knew that by dawn, the road would be scrubbed. The government has a way of making the impossible look like a routine accident. But how does a 700-pound animal simply vanish from a paved road without leaving a single trace? I've seen them do it before. They use chemical agents that neutralize biological scents, leaving the woods smelling like a hospital hallway. If I'd known that the pulse the doctor described was connected to the tracks I'd find later that morning, I would have brought something more substantial than my tracking kit. I headed out while the mist was still thick. The asphalt was unnaturally clean. There were no skid marks, no glass from a shattered headlight, and no blood. It was as if the entire event had been edited out of existence. I stepped off the shoulder and into the tree line, my boots sinking into the damp moss. Most people look for the big things, but I look for the leftovers. I found a single, massive tuft of coarse, hollow hair caught in the jagged edge of a guardrail. It was thick, tipped with a strange silver sheen, and when I brought it to my nose, that scent of ozone was still there. This wasn't a bear. This was a match for a hair sample I'd collected back in 1998 after a series of livestock disappearances that the local papers blamed on a rogue cougar. But the government isn't interested in cougars. They're interested in what that hair represents: a Sasquatch, a biological anomaly that shouldn't be walking on 2 legs. I followed the faint indentation of a heavy weight being dragged deeper into the brush. They didn't take the body away in a truck. They moved it into the thicket. I met the doctor at a small clinic later that afternoon. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 12 hours. He looked at me and said, "Dave, I felt it. It was a rhythmic, heavy thrumming beneath the scapula." He explained that in any known primate or carnivore, the heart is protected by the rib cage. But this thing had a secondary pump, a reinforced chamber of muscle situated in the mid-back. It was like a bellows in a blacksmith's forge, stoking a fire that shouldn't be burning. It suggested an animal, a true Sasquatch, engineered for high-intensity, low-oxygen environments, the kind of places where humans can't function, let alone run. Thorn showed me his sketches. They were anatomical nightmares. He'd drawn a skeletal structure that looked like a hybrid between a man and something much older. The rib cage was barrel-shaped, and the mid-back, was where the mystery lived. He believed this secondary pulse was a biological redundant engine. It allowed the neighbor to move at speeds that would cause a human heart to fail. The being was a miracle of evolution, or something else entirely. But as we sat there, the air in the room suddenly felt cold. I looked out the window and saw a dark sedan idling across the street. 2 men were sitting inside, not moving, just watching the clinic. They weren't patrol officers. They had that blank, bureaucratic stare that tells you they've already decided your fate. Who is monitoring the frequency of a small-town medical professional? The realization hit us both at once. We weren't just investigating a mystery, we were being measured. Thorn grabbed a small glass vial from his desk, a sample he'd managed to snag while the deputies were distracted. It was a thick, dark fluid, with a consistency like heavy oil. We knew we couldn't stay in town. If we wanted to understand what that secondary pulse meant, we had to go where the technology of the modern world couldn't follow. We had to go into the dead zone, a stretch of high timber where granite plays havoc with radio signals and GPS. If you want to follow this investigation deeper and see the truth they're trying to bury, you need to subscribe now, because what we found in that dead zone changes everything. We left the clinic through the back alley, avoiding the main roads. As we climbed in elevation, the radio in my truck began to hiss with static, eventually losing power completely. But then something happened that made my hair stand up. The vial of indigo fluid in Thorn's lap began to pulse. Not a vibration from the truck, but a steady, warm heat. As we crossed the 4,000-foot line, the fluid was reacting to the elevation, shifting and swirling like it was waking up. The forest was changing. The birds had stopped singing. It was that heavy, oppressive silence that precedes a predator's arrival. I've tracked through these woods for 4 decades, and I've learned that when the forest goes quiet, you stop being the observer and start being the observed. We trekked into a box canyon, a natural trap of steep stone walls and ancient hemlocks. As we pushed through the brush, we found the first sign that we were in the right place. It was a tripod, 15 feet tall, constructed from 3 massive hemlock trees that had been uprooted and leaned against each other. The roots were still covered in fresh earth, but the trunks were stripped of their bark. This wasn't the work of the wind. It was a signal, a boundary marker telling us that we had crossed into a territory where the rules of man no longer applied. Thorn stared up at it, trying to calculate the force required to lift a ton of timber into that position. I just looked at the ground. There, in the soft mud beneath the tripod, was a print. It was 22 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and a mid-tarsal break, the unmistakable calling card of a Sasquatch. The mystery of the back pulse began to take on a new weight. If this thing had a redundant circulatory system, it meant it could exert itself far beyond the limits of any known animal. It could climb these vertical rock faces without stopping for air. Thorn whispered a theory that made my skin crawl. He suggested that the secondary pulse might be a way for the neighbor to regulate its body temperature, making it nearly invisible to thermal imaging. It was a biological cloaking device. We were standing in the middle of a hunting ground, and we were the only things in it that weren't optimized for the dark. The stakes weren't just about finding a neighbor anymore. They were about surviving a confrontation with a Sasquatch that had been designed to be the perfect ghost. Then, the air changed. It didn't just get colder, it started to vibrate. My chest felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand, and a wave of sudden nausea washed over me. I've felt this before. It's the fear frequency infrasound. As the frequency ramped up, the old injury in my shattered shoulder began to throb with a deep, grinding ache, my body reacting to the wall of sound I couldn't hear. Thorn collapsed to one knee, clutching his midsection. His watch, a mechanical piece, started to rattle against his wrist. The vibration was so intense, it was shaking our gear. We weren't hearing anything, but every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. I felt as though the end of my journey was imminent. I grabbed Thorn and hauled him up. We had to move. I pulled out my own thermal camera, an older model that doesn't rely on a digital network. I panned it across the dark wall of the forest. For a moment, there was nothing but the blue and green of the cold timber. Then, I saw it. High up in the branches of a massive pine was a heat signature that shouldn't have been there. It was a massive humanoid shape, but the heat wasn't concentrated in the chest. There was a bright, pulsing hot spot right in the center of its back. It didn't look like a biological organ. It looked like a burning coal, a second sun trapped inside the Sasquatch's frame. The creature was perched there, perfectly still, watching us through the infrasound wall it had projected. It wasn't just an animal, it was a tactician. It was using our own biological weaknesses against us. The hot spot on the FLIR screen pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. It was the back heart in action, pumping copper-rich blood to the neighbor's extremities, dissipating heat so rapidly that the rest of its body was almost invisible. I watched as the signature shifted. It launched itself, clearing 20 feet of open air between trees with a grace that was startling to behold. The heat signature vanished behind a curtain of needles, and the infrasound pressure suddenly lifted. We were left gasping for air in the sudden silence. Thorn looked at me, his eyes wide. "Did you see it?" He breathed. The pulse. It sped up right before it jumped. We were no longer looking for a mangled bear. We were looking for the apex of Sasquatch biology. We moved toward the area where the neighbor had landed, our lanterns cutting through the gloom. We found the spot where it had finally rested. The pine needles were matted down, but there was something else. A fluid was splattered across the branches. I reached out to touch it, expecting the sticky red of life fluid. But as my light hit the drops, I realized they were a deep, shimmering indigo. It looked like ink, but it had the metallic smell of copper and that sharp ozone bite. This was the fluid from the road incident. This was the life force of the Sasquatch. Thorn pulled out a sterile glass vial and carefully collected the sample. His hands were shaking so hard I had to hold his wrist steady. "Blue fluid," he whispered. "High copper content. This is how they survive at high altitudes. This is how they move like that." Possessing that vial felt like holding a live explosive. This was the God-grade, evidence that the world has been searching for, proof of a different kind of life. But as the vial clicked shut, the silence of the woods was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical beat of rotors. A black, unmarked helicopter was cresting the ridge, moving low over the trees, its spotlight carving a path through the mist. They hadn't used lights until they were right on top of us. They knew exactly where we were. I looked at the vial. It was still pulsing with heat, acting like a beacon. How did they track us into a dead zone where no signal could escape? The helicopter hovered over the canyon, the downdraft from its blades whipping the trees into a frenzy. I saw the silhouettes of men in tactical gear, fast roping down into the clearing. They didn't have any insignias. They were just shadows with long-range equipment. They weren't there to find the neighbor. They were there to find us. Or specifically, the vial in Thorn's pocket. I knew this canyon better than any man alive. I'd spent 20 years mapping the cave systems that honeycombed the granite beneath our feet. I grabbed Thorn and shoved him toward a jagged opening in the rock face, a hole hidden by a curtain of heavy lichen. "Down," I hissed, "and don't turn on your light. What do you think this neighbor really is? Is it a relic of a lost human branch? Comment below with your theories, and tell me what mystery I should tackle next in these mountains. Your insights are the only thing they can't classify." As we slid into the darkness of the lava tube, the sound of the helicopter became a muffled thrumming. The air in the cave was ancient, smelling of wet stone and something much older. We moved by touch, our hands scraping against sharp volcanic rock. I led Thorn deeper into the mountain, toward a chamber I'd found years ago. It was a place where the walls were covered in markings that looked like tallies, etched into the stone by something with Sasquatch claws. We reached a small alcove and risked a dim light, Thorn held up the vial. In the darkness, the indigo fluid seemed to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light. But as we explored the chamber, we found something that made our blood run cold. In the corner of the cave were discarded pieces of medical waste, modern syringes and canisters labeled with alphanumeric codes from the late 90s. This wasn't a wild cave, it was a disposal site. One canister had a faded government property stamp that looked like the ones I saw during my time in the service. The government hadn't just been hiding these creatures, they'd been here. They'd been extracting something. I realized then that the secondary pulse isn't just a biological fluke, it's a resource. Thorn began to examine the medical waste with a professional's eye. He pointed to a rusted containment grid, a heavy metal frame bolted to the cave floor that looked designed to hold a Sasquatch with immense strength. "They aren't just studying them, Dave," he said, his voice trembling. "They're harvesting them." He explained that a redundant circulatory system could be the key to revolutionary medical treatments, organ preservation, or cellular regeneration. This was a bio-gold rush. The neighbors were being captured and processed in the shadows of the mountains I called home. The government wasn't protecting the public from a monster. They were protecting a pharmaceutical monopoly. It was a betrayal of everything natural and right. The revelation was a hammer blow. Every bear incident, every missing hiker, every strange light, it was all part of a systematic extraction program. We were sitting on the evidence of the greatest crime in the history of science. We knew the truth, but that truth made us the most dangerous people in the state. We had to get that vial out of the mountain. We had to survive the night, outrun the tactical teams, and find a way to tell the world before we were erased. I knew a way out through the lower tunnels that would dump us out miles from the canyon, near an old truck cache. We moved through the tunnels for hours. The air grew warmer as we descended, and finally we saw the faint grey light of the storm-racked sky. We emerged into a scree field, the rain lashing down. The thunder was our cover. I led Thorn to an old '79 Ford I'd tucked away years ago. It was a mechanical beast, no computers for the feds to monitor. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, a beautiful sound that drowned out the distant beat of the rotors. We were moving. We were escaping. But as we reached the county line, I looked at Thorn and saw the look of a man who knew his old life had passed away. A week later, I returned to town. Thorn's clinic was boarded up with plywood. A sign on the door said, "Closed for sabbatical." I checked the local news, and there it was, a small blurb about a missing hiker in the High Cascades, a Dr. Aris Thorn. They'd deleted him. They'd taken his practice and his name. The vial was gone. I sat in my truck, the rain drumming on the roof, feeling the weight of the mountain. I felt like I'd failed him. But then, I checked my mailbox. There was a single piece of paper inside, no words, just a hand-drawn sketch of a dual heart system with a small arrow pointing toward the mountains. He was still out there. He was in the shadows, just like the Sasquatch he'd tried to save. Share this with anyone who's ready to know the truth. The world needs to know that we aren't alone. I'm back in my cabin now, looking at the Highway 20 ridge. I think about that secondary pulse every night. I think about the rhythm of a world that they try so hard to convince us doesn't exist. The feds can scrub the asphalt and board up every clinic, but they can't stop the heartbeat of the mountain. I can still hear it when the wind is right, a low, rhythmic thrumming coming from the trees, smelling of ozone and wet copper. The second pulse isn't just biology. It's a reminder. It's a reminder that there are mysteries still hiding in the deep places, and there are truths that are worth every sacrifice. I don't know if I'll ever see Thorn again, or if the Sasquatch I saw on the Fleer will ever cross my path, but I know they're out there. I know that the indigo fluid is still flowing in the veins of something that defies every book ever written. I'm 66 years old, and I've seen the face of the unknown. It's not a monster. It's a person, different from us, but deserving of a life that isn't lived in a laboratory. I'm Dave Mitchell, and I'll keep watching these ridges as long as my lungs can pull in the mountain air. They want you to believe the world is small and explained. But I'm here to tell you that the map is a lie. The real world starts where the pavement ends, and the real truth is beating right behind you in the dark. The forest doesn't just keep its secrets, it buries them under a mountain of lies that they hope you're too busy or too comfortable to ever uncover. If you're ready to leave the safety of the paved roads behind and follow me deeper into the heavy timber, where the official maps go blank, hit that subscribe button and stay close to the fire. I want to hear your theories in the comments. What do you think is really driving that second heartbeat in the dark, and how long has the government been harvesting it? Your insights are the only thing they can't classify, so keep the conversation going. Until next time, I'll keep watching the ridge and listening for that ozone hum, because as long as that indigo pulse is out there, the truth will never truly pass away.